Oh, we appreciate Kent being here from CFR. Adam and I, my son and I, were at the Ocean Point Christian Church up in Newport, Rhode Island about 5 or 6 years ago, and Tri-Village did support that church for its first 5 years of existence as one of our new church plant partners. And so if you're ever up in the Rhode Island area, you want to check it out, Ocean Point Christian Church. In fact, we've been there 2 more times since it's the beginning of that church, and I appreciate Kent and traveling over here from Indianapolis with CFR. As I always tell Kent, keep my $8 safe that I've got invested with CFR. I got to retire on that one day, all right? So glad that he was here today. We're continuing a sermon series and wrapping it up today entitled, In the Wilderness When Your Faith is Tested. And I want you to turn to Numbers chapter 20. The sermon title is Overreacting When God is Preparing to Work. Overreacting when God is preparing to work. David Rower, in his book, The Sacred Wilderness of Pastoral Ministry, writes in the opening chapter, which he entitles Consolation, his inner thoughts about pastoral ministry. Here's what he writes. Pastor goes postal. I've never seen this headline on the front page of a newspaper, yet it would not surprise me if someday I did. Looking back on my years in pastoral ministry, I can recall times when I'm glad I did not have an automatic weapon at my disposal. While I don't think I was ever angry enough to fire directly at members of the congregation, the thought of shooting out a few windows in the sanctuary in the presence of the gathered congregation has certainly crossed my mind. Some of you maybe could relate to that. Any career that deals with lots of people and the demands that can be placed on one can cause a person to think like that. You know, it can be a teacher in a classroom. It can be the coach of a basketball team. It can be the supervisor doing evaluations. It can be the officer attempting to break up a fight. It can be the preacher who feels pressured by congregants. Any of us can overreact to a situation, and the reasons for that overreaction can be legion. Physical fatigue, mental stress, emotional instability, hyped attention, or just plain impatience. Now, in this sermon series, In the Wilderness, When Your Faith is Tested, we've mostly been focusing on the response of the Israelites as former slaves in Egypt as they worked their way towards the promised land of Canaan. But today, we're going to focus more on their leader, Moses. Just as God was beginning to perform the miracle of getting his people into the promised land, Moses overreacted. Have you ever overreacted? Maybe as a teacher, a student, a parent, an employee, an employer. Maybe you suddenly felt trapped in a circumstance and without thinking through it, you responded somewhat irrationally, and if you could do it all over again, you would. Now, we have seen over the last 4 Sundays, the previous 4 Sundays, where Moses was in different scenarios, and today we're going to see him in one more. Now, Moses was a humble man, and his life was characterized by faithful obedience. He had been miraculously kept alive when Pharaoh ordered the death of all the Hebrew male children, and the Lord worked events so that Pharaoh's daughter would raise him. In that position, Moses had enjoyed the best Egypt had to offer, with a lifetime of security and influence in front of him, yet he abandoned everything in order to identify with God's people, who were then the lowest of slaves. And Moses obeyed God's call to lead the people out of bondage in spite of the fact he felt completely inadequate. He felt unprepared. He spent the rest of his life interceding for the Israelites, being an intermediary between them and God. And he was willing to do all of that in the fact of the constant rebellion and the continual complaints he heard from the people. He endured the cries of some of the Israelites who felt he was unworthy to lead them. They wanted to return to Egypt. I suspect there were days Moses would have gladly handed his staff to some Israelite in the group and say, "Here, you lead them. See if you can do any better. I've had all I can take." You know, I got to thinking about that. Any man who has a congregation of 2 to 3 million people and he leads them for 40 years without slugging somebody has my respect. Are you tracking with me here in what I'm saying? Abraham Lincoln was a leader who safely guided the United States through one of its most difficult storms, and his was an ominous leadership task: to hold together a fractured, warring nation until the issues dividing it could be resolved and unity restored. Now, as you know, there's a lot of darkness in Lincoln's life. His mother died when he was 9. He had a sister die when he was 19. His father remarried a woman with 3 small children. The family lived in a very small log cabin. And because he was awkward and very unattractive — by the way, David Brown's a relative of Lincoln, just threw that in there on that part right there — Lincoln was teased by his childhood peers a lot about his awkwardness and his unattractiveness. But you know the story. Lincoln overcame the dark side of childhood and youth and is still one of the most remarkable and noted presidents in our nation's history. Lincoln said, "All human beings have their weaknesses, but not all of us realize them, come to grips with them, or offset their negative impact. As a group whose primary endeavor is interacting with other people, leaders must accomplish the paradoxical task of managing their darker sides." Now, that is a quote of Lincoln's, but it comes out of a book entitled Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership. In other words, what Lincoln was saying is, he says, we have the task of leading people if you're a leader in any kind of group or organization, but at the same time as you are leading, you have the task of trying to control your own darker side. So I want us to see a dark side of Moses. He is human. He is fallible. There's an instance in his life where it shows very noticeably, and we're going to see Moses overreacting just as God was preparing to lead his people into the promised land. So open to Numbers chapter 20 if you want to follow along and take notes. Open our church app, and sermon notes there should have the outline for you. This is somewhat of a somber and a sad story. So we begin by noticing the setting for Moses' anger. Now this is where we're going to spend most of our time. Now we've moved since last week almost 40 years towards the promised land. But last week, 40 years ago, they were ready to enter the promised land, and due to their complaining and accepting of the bad report from the 10 negative spies, God turns them away from the promised land he had given to them. The old generation of people, those who were 20 and older, except for just a few of them, have died. Gravestones must have littered the path around the wilderness of Zin. The unbelieving in this huge crowd of millions had voted no about entering the land of Canaan, and then God voted death for them. Moses had buried many a soul. He had performed many a funeral in those 40 years. Now, part of this setting where Moses finds himself, his sister Miriam has died. Look at Numbers 20, verse 1. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. You know, of thousands upon thousands of funerals that Moses performed, I think this one had to be the most difficult to date. You remember Moses' sister, Miriam? She's the one who pushed the basket into the reeds of the Nile River when Moses was an infant, so Pharaoh's daughter could raise him. She is the one who ran back to get the biological mother to Moses so that she could nurse him. And I think at the beginning of this chapter, Moses is grieving. He is emotionally exhausted. He had one of the most difficult funerals he's ever officiated at in his entire life. Today is January 30th. I have already officiated this year at 4 funerals. I'm averaging 1 per week already. I hope that average goes way down. I don't want to have 52 funerals in a year. When I get back from a funeral, I am absolutely drained, both physically and emotionally. Moses had to have been drained physically and emotionally. Another part of this setting is there was no water to drink, verse 2. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. Now here they are, no water again. We've heard about this before. This happened before almost 40 years ago. No water, yet they still have 2 to 3 million people traveling together. They still have all the livestock to take care of their needs for eating and other things, and yet that would be disastrous to have no water. Now, if you've gone without water for a long period of time, you know how thirsty you can get. Or maybe it is you just simply need to have a medical procedure, and so the night before you can't eat anything, you can't drink anything, and you know you wake up that next morning for that procedure. Maybe you don't normally drink a lot of water in the morning, but the morning you can't have any, guess what? You're thirsty, aren't you? Just because you've been told you can't have any water. Miriam has died, there is no water, and Moses is being criticized again by the people. Verse 3. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Like Moses didn't already know that. They're just rubbing it in on the poor guy. Poor Moses. He's getting criticized again. He had heard that opening phrase hundreds of times before, "If only." Moses, if only you had done this differently, we would have been a lot better. Moses, if only you hadn't done this, we'd be a lot better off. I bet he was thinking every time he started hearing that, "Hey, listen, I tried to fight this thing at that bush that was on fire and started talking to me. I did my very best to not be your leader. Don't gripe at me." And the people give this list of problems about where they are, and it is true. It's no vacation in the Sinai wilderness. It was plain, it was lacking in vegetation, it was hot, there was no grain, there was no water to drink. But poor Moses, he's just doing what God told him to do. Now, there's one other thing about Moses here. It's not mentioned in this text, but we know it's true. Moses is old. Moses is pushing 120 years of age at this point. I want to say something here about getting older. How do I say this? Some of us start getting kind of crotchety in our 50s. And then some in their 60s aren't too fun to live with. And Moses is double that. He's 120. His fuse is short. Age is not always kind to the aging. He had put up with a hot desert for 40 years. He had put up with some ornery people for the same amount of time. And so Moses responds to this issue of no water by immediately seeking the Lord. Verse 6. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now, we skipped over the parts from last week to this week where were given instructions about having the traveling worship building, which is the tabernacle, to go with them. That is the tent of meeting. And Moses and Aaron fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Now, Moses and Aaron did the right thing here. They went to find out how they should handle this problem of no water where it was desperately needed. Whenever you're pushed into a corner, the best place to go is straight to the Lord. Lord, I don't know how this happened or why I'm here right now, but I need you. I need your word. I need your spirit to guide me. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like you've been painted into a corner? Because that's exactly what Moses felt like here. Verse 7. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it'll pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm, and he struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Now, if you recall, 40 years earlier, God wanted to wipe out all the people because of their lack of faith and their complaining. Moses pleaded with God not to do that. I wonder if Moses regretted that right about now. I think Moses had reached the threshold of his tolerance, and maybe he hoped this would be the day that God would wipe them all out. He was tired of the journey. He was tired of the people. His patience was thin. I have a minister friend who told me that sometimes he gets really frustrated at various people in his church, and he's even found himself praying about a person who's maybe been a person that's been very critical of his ministry, and then that person suddenly gets ill. And he said, I'll be honest, he said, sometimes I've had to pray, Lord, instead of healing them, would you take them? And he said, sometimes I have prayed that prayer. But as Moses was waiting on God to send lightning and just to obliviate this group of people, God said something very simple to Moses. God said, Moses, I want you to speak to the rock, and water is going to come gushing forth. Moses took the staff, and he gathered the people as the Lord had commanded him. But then we see a level of frustration that we've not yet seen from Moses. Moses says, listen, you rebels, but that wouldn't be how he said it. In fact, in the Hebrew, it is, listen, you rebels. He is furious. This is not the picture of one of the disciples of Jesus sitting at the Last Supper posing for a painting. That is not the picture. This is a man who is furious that once again he's in this spot where he has to gather these people together and remind them again, God will provide for your needs. He has done this time after time again. And Moses' anger became intense here because even he forgot who was providing the water. He goes on and says, must we bring you water out of this rock? The we is Moses and Aaron. They weren't the ones bringing water from the rock. They weren't drilling for a well. They're just representing God. And Moses says, I'll show you some water, and boom, boom. He strikes the rock twice. Now, thankfully, God's grace allowed the water to flow. J. Oswald Sanders has an old book out from many years ago called Spiritual Leadership. There's a chapter entitled Peculiar Perils of Leadership. And he wrote about some of the subtle dangers that one has to guard against in leadership. He said there's pride, ego, popularity, infallibility, indispensability, depression. But I think he forgot one. I think he forgot irritability. Now, psychologists tell us there are different levels of anger. I'm going to list 5 of them for you. Number 1, there's irritation. Irritation. Irritation is caused by an uneasiness, an unpleasant disturbance. It's like a traffic jam or something doesn't work right at the house. It might be caused by a lack of sleep. Things just grate on you. That's irritation. Level of irritation. Some of you maybe already hit that this morning on your way to church. Maybe you had something go wrong on your way to church and you already hit that level and you're just a little bit irritated and something just grates against your nerves. Number 2, indignation. Indignation, that's a reaction to something that is unfair or unreasonable. It might be like an example would be a fan at a ball game who yells at the ref thinking the call was unreasonable. Some of you today will hit this level of indignation, okay, while you're watching some playoff games. This is a possible place for you to get to. The 3rd level is wrath. Something that's expressed in a manner to show one's displeasure. Not much restraint is given when a person hits the level of wrath. It might be through the use of some harsh words. For example, an employee may go into his supervisor's office for an evaluation and comes out and he looks at another coworker and says, boy, did I get her wrath this morning. Fury is the 4th level. It's often a loss of control. You strike out at someone or something. It goes beyond words. It results in some kind of action that can be devastating to the person who's on the receiving end of it. And then 5th, there is rage. The most intense level of anger. It's usually dangerous. It's usually brutal violence that can occur as a result of this kind of anger. Psychologists will tell us that there are people who can even commit a murder and not know they are doing it because of the rage that is built up inside of them. I think Moses fell between wrath and fury. He had done really well for 40 years. But all that accumulated anger, that hurt, that exasperation with people had built up within him, and then he exploded like a once dormant volcano. The loss of his sister, the deaths of many friends, the wandering for 40 years. Now, I'm not judging Moses. I'm just making some observations. Because here's what I think. I think any of us would have lost our cools long before this. He lashed out. And when God said, "Speak to the rock, Moses," Moses took that staff and boom, boom. I think there might be another reason. I think there might be an unspoken one by Moses as to why he had this fit of rage. Was Moses disappointed with God? He is a believer. He is one of the few that made it through the 40 years of wandering and didn't die because of his lack of faith. Have you ever been disappointed with God? Have you prayed prayers and have you wondered, "Lord, if you aren't dead, are you deaf?" Now, we know God does not do anything wrong. He cannot sin. But from our limited perspective of Him, and sometimes a bit of our own emotional instability, we can feel disappointment. Philip Yancey's book, Disappointment with God, is a great work, especially if you're struggling maybe in your faith. Yancey writes, "I found that for many people, there's a large gap between what they expect from their Christian faith and what they actually experience. Disappointment occurs when the actual experience of something falls far short of what we anticipate. Once, as I explained this project about the writing of that book to a friend, he frowned and shook his head. 'I guess I've never tried to psychoanalyze God before,' he said." And Yancey says, "I hope that's not what I'm attempting, but I do wish to understand God better, to learn why He sometimes acts in such mysterious ways or He does not seem to act at all." The overreaction of Moses could be attributed to a lot of factors, but there's a very sobering response from God, and it is in Numbers 20, verse 12, and that is the gravity of God's judgment. "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them.'" God pulled Moses and Aaron aside from the people for a little private conversation. He's having a little huddle, a little powwow here, if you will. God gives a very severe punishment for Moses' act of anger. God will not allow Moses to enter the promised land. You've heard people that have road rage. Moses had rod rage. He took his rod and beat that rock when he shouldn't have. And thankfully for the people, the water came gushing out of the rock, but the Lord came rushing in. And later on, Moses is even going to plead with God to reverse this decision. And he says, "God, will you reverse the decision? Will you allow me to enter into the promised land?" But God still said no. That little scenario occurs in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 3. Now, Deuteronomy is really called, its subtitle is the Book of the Second Law. Deuteronomy is kind of a repeat of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers of all the laws that the people have already had through these 40 years given to them by God. And Moses is going to repeat these laws before he makes his final track towards the promised land. And in Deuteronomy 3, beginning at verse 23, "At that time I pleaded with the Lord," that's Moses pleading, "Sovereign Lord, you've begun to show to your servants your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do the deeds and mighty works you do? Let me go over and see this good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country and Lebanon. But because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. That is enough," the Lord said. "Do not speak to me any more about this matter." Parents, you've done this to your kids. Or maybe you as a child growing up had this done to you by your parents. You asked your mom or your dad, "Hey, could I go somewhere?" "No, you can't go." And you go back an hour, "Can I go?" "I told you once you can't go. Do not come to me and ask again." The answer is still no. That is exactly what was happening to Moses here. And so God says, "Go up to the top of Pisgah, look west and north and south and east, look at the land with your own eyes, since you're not going to cross this Jordan. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead this people across and will cause them to inherit the land that you will see." So we stayed in the valley near Beth Peor. Is God being unjust? Is God being too harsh with Moses? Why such a permanent punishment for a momentary mistake? Well, one of the reasons this punishment was harsh is because this was a public sin. Moses had set a terrible example of disobedience for the people, and to allow Moses to get by without being punished would encourage even more disobedience from the people. So God said no. This punishment was severe because it was a repeated sin. It was a public sin. It was a repeated sin. This is not Moses' first loss of temper. It seems he has a little bit of a character flaw in this area. At the age of 40, Moses killed an Egyptian taskmaster who had beaten an Israelite slave. Now, the taskmaster should not have beaten the slave, but Moses should not have killed the taskmaster. At the age of 80, Moses is leaving Mount Sinai with 2 tablets, having the 10 Commandments on them, the law for the people. And as he goes down, as he descends Mount Sinai, he sees the people worshiping a golden calf in the valley below, and he throws and smashes the tablets. And here at the age of 120, Moses flays away at the rock when he was told to only speak to it. And this act of anger in Numbers 20, it wasn't just a one-time occurrence. And this punishment was severe because it was a serious sin. It was a public sin. It was a repeated sin. It was a serious sin. So one of the things we miss sometimes in Scripture is there's a lot of symbolism in the Bible. And this rock is a very important symbol in the Old Testament. But we're not told about it until the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning at verse 1. The Apostle Paul writes, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea." So they were under the cloud that guided them. They passed through the Red Sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. The rock was the message of Jesus. Now, Moses could not have known that. God had not given Moses a script to read for centuries ahead. But God did expect Moses to follow his plan and remain obedient to him. When Moses struck the rock, it removed what God desired to teach his people about a coming Savior. You know, it's rare that we ever see God working ahead. Mostly, we see in retrospect how God enabled us to get through a circumstance. And Moses messed up the message. Now, even though the punishment was severe, and even though it was a public sin, and even though it was a repeated sin, and even though it was a serious sin, it was also a forgiven sin. Now, Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land of Canaan, but he did enter heaven. When Jesus is transfigured later in the New Testament, in Matthew 17, there are 2 others who join him on that mountain of transfiguration. It's Moses and Elijah. Moses did not set foot in the promised land on earth, but he did walk into the promised land of eternity. Verse 13 of Numbers 20. "These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them." Meribah means quarreling. It means provocation. It means strife. It means litigation. It's a place where God took action against Moses. This place of Meribah became significant for the Israelites as they prepared to cross into the promised land. Moses had reached the point where he would now see his family members dying. Chapter 20, verse 1 opens with Miriam dying. But then at the end of the chapter, his brother Aaron dies. Within a very short period, probably within a few days, he's lost his only sister. He's lost his only brother. As you get older, you reach the point where you start to see your family members going away. Barb and I have reached that point of life where all of our aunts and uncles are all gone. I have 1 aunt and 1 uncle left. My mom there were 10 in her family. She was one of 10 children. All of them are gone. My dad was one of 6, and there's just 1 sister, his youngest sister, living, and she's near 80 now, living in Florida. She and my uncle, that's my only aunt and uncle left out of all of them. And some of the children of those, some of my cousins are gone. On the one side, on my mom's side of the family, there are 5 of us left out of 26 grandchildren, just 5 of us left. On the other side, there's still 11 of us left out of the 12. But Moses had reached that point where he's watching his family members die one by one. His sister Miriam had died. His brother Aaron had died. And what needed to occur was that Moses would die to himself. Oh, there's 2 lessons for us today I want to pull out of this passage. And here's the first one. Addressing character flaws can be a constant battle. Stay alert. Addressing character flaws can be a constant battle. Stay alert. You would think at the age of 120, Moses would have overcome the issue of anger with which he dealt occasionally. Most of us have character flaws that we have to address at times. There's temper and lust, greed, bad language, laziness, pride, or maybe all of the above. And if we're not cautious, an area where we might struggle can prevent God from doing His best work in us. And sometimes we stay in Meribah, where there's some strife. We wrestle with ourselves, we wrestle with God, we wrestle even with others as we maybe work through an area of weakness. Now, I wish I could tell you that you'll keep growing spiritually and you're going to reach a point in life that you'll no longer have a particular sin that'll ever tempt you again, but I can't do that. Have you ever struggled with a particular temptation? And then in your mind you think, I was struggling with that 20 years ago. Why does that occur? It's because Satan knows all of our weak spots, and he knows which one to keep attacking. I love that old story of the 4 men in an accountability group in their church, and they were sharing their temptations together. And one of them said, I struggle with lust. Please pray for me. Another one said, I struggle with greed. Can you give me some advice? The third one said, my weakness is pride. I always want to be the first in everything. And the fourth one said, I'm tempted to gossip, and I can't wait to get out of here. All of the frustrations that Moses had been carrying for 40 years of leading millions of complaining people suddenly festered and he exploded. Stay alert to the area where you can be easily tempted. One final lesson. Dying to self can be difficult. Remember, it is about God. Dying to self can be difficult. Remember, it's about God. Moses had been a witness of God's miracles in his life for over 4 decades. He and God had some serious conversations about the rebellion of the people as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. But Moses learned that dying to self is not easy. Moses thought he had to be strong for the people. He thought he had to carry the burden of getting water from the rock, and that was God's role. I've struggled with that during this pandemic. Many in ministry have struggled with how things have gone with their congregations during this 2 years of flatten the curve. And honestly, many of us in ministry, what we have seen is not the curve flattened of COVID, but also what we have seen flattened is congregations with attendance flattening, declining, or inconsistent at best. And we know the situation with COVID is still very fluid. And I know there are many people still struggling with, am I going to get the Omicron variant? Or can I try to avoid it by staying away from crowds? But often that kind of struggle is an indictment of ego. Because it's easy to attach numbers to the success of everything we do, including church. It's easy to want to see tangible results in practical ways that makes one's ministry say, I believe I'm making a difference. And I think Moses struggled with that. I think he'd reached the point of his life. I've been leading these people for 40 years, and I'm not sure if my ministry is still making a difference. He struggled with that. I know I do. Moses taught the people about reliance on God. Often they would not listen or they would not obey very well. But then one has to realize, one person cannot carry the burden. When that happens, you get an overreaction, like the one we see here in Numbers 20 with Moses. Dying to self can be difficult. Kyle Idleman has out a great little book. You ought to read it if you haven't. It's called The End of Me. He writes, we tend to revert to the human default, which is pride and self-importance and the deep desire to impress others. Getting to the end of me means coming to the end of my strength. I think Moses physically dying was easier for him than dying to self. As the Israelites would prepare to enter the promised land, God would allow Moses to climb Mount Nebo and look over into it. But he was going to die on that mountain. The Egyptian pharaohs built huge pyramids to mark the burial of their leaders. But God buried Moses in an unmarked grave. But don't feel sorry for Moses. His gravesite didn't matter. He would later appear with Jesus and Elijah, confirming his entrance into the eternal promised land. And Numbers chapter 20 tells about the deaths of Miriam and Aaron. Moses would die before entering the promised land of Canaan. But the ultimate example in death is Jesus. He died to self for us. There are sins and there are moments in our lives we cannot erase. Oh, we wish we could. We've all had them. We've all had that text we wished we hadn't sent, that email we wished we hadn't sent, that word that we wished hadn't come out of our mouth, that action that had occurred. We've all had those sins in the moments we wish we could take back. And we know that thousands of deaths won't pay for our sins, but we know that one death did. Let's pray. Father, as we come to remember Christ and what He's done for us, may we be reminded through this story about Moses that the message is about Jesus. And may we not mess up the message that has been given to us. Thank you that we can have hope and forgiveness because of what Jesus did for us upon the cross of Calvary. And it's in His name we pray. Amen.